In this episode, we're looking at infrared photography, which I'm really keen on. By filtering the light going to your camera's sensor, you can expose it to infrared wavelengths and produce some fascinating imagery. Whether your final image ends up as black and white or color depends on the type of filter you choose, and we'll get to that later in the video. For now, we'll look at the most inexpensive approach to getting into infrared photography, which is to use an infrared filter in front of your lens. So with our first example, I'll start by focusing the lens to ensure a sharp result, but I will have to refocus in a minute and I'll explain why. I'll then take a test photograph to ensure I'm happy with the composition. Now what I'll do is attach an infrared filter to the front of my lens. I've chosen a 720 nanometer filter, which means any light below that wavelength is cut. 720 nanometers is a fairly standard choice that tends to produce infrared photography suitable for black and white conversion. I now need to refocus the lens. This is because infrared light has longer waves and so focuses at a different point. If you own a mirrorless camera or a camera with live view, this is made easier by being able to magnify your screen or use focus peaking. Also, many vintage lenses designed for film cameras will have infrared focus markings on the lens barrel. This old Tacchina lens has a little red mark next to the green mark, which helps to indicate how much to shift the focus by when shooting infrared. With my focus set, I now need to access my shooting modes menu, and I'll change from a single shot mode to a 2-second timed release. This is to prevent camera shake from ruining the shot. I'm in aperture priority mode, and notice the camera's metering has determined a shutter speed of 3.2 seconds. The result is quite underexposed, so we'll need to increase the exposure time. This is because cameras ordinarily block infrared light, so when we only pass infrared light through to the sensor, we need much longer exposure times to capture it. Additionally, I'm going to set a custom white balance. The auto white balancing produces a heavy red cast, which needs to be corrected. Otherwise, the camera will expose for the red channel at the expense of precision in the green and blue channels. To do this, I'll move my white balance across to capture white balance, which allows me to present a white surface in front of the camera and balance off that. I've actually just balanced off the scene in general, which is enough to neutralize the red cast and give me an almost monochromatic result. Now I'll increase the exposure compensation to +2 stops, giving me a shutter speed of 13 seconds. Okay, so we've corrected the red cast, but the image is still quite underexposed. I'll move the exposure compensation up to +3 stops, giving a shutter speed of 25 seconds. This result will have to do, as I am risking overexposing the sky at the top of the image. Here's an edited version, which I've converted to black and white. When it comes to white balancing, you could also use a white balance card. In this example, I'm once again setting my white balance to capture WB, but this time I'll use a color checker passport as my white source. As before, I need to adjust my exposure compensation to +3 stops, and I'll actually stop down to f3.5 to sharpen the image up slightly rather than shooting wide open. The result is quite pleasant, and there's some highlight blooming through the trees here. It also converts nicely to a black and white image. Now let's move on to my preferred method of infrared photography, using a converted camera. You can have a camera body converted to infrared through various online sites, or you can buy converted bodies on eBay. Here I've got an old Olympus EP1 converted with a 590 nanometer infrared filter. I've chosen a lower value filter to let through what's called false color, and this is how you get those Goldie shots, as the term is coined. With a custom white balance, I'll take a shot of this old chapel and look at the colors here. Foliage works really well as it emits a lot of infrared light, but the false color also produces a nice counterpoint with the stonework and sky. Here's an edited version where I've performed a red and blue channel swap, then enhanced the tones. You can also experiment with HDR infrared. Here I'm setting an aperture of f4 and taking my base image. Then I'll alter the exposure compensation. So I'll start with -1 stop and take an image. Then I'll move to -2 stops. And finally, minus 3 stops. After that, I'll move to positive compensation, so I'll bring it up to plus 1 stop, then plus 2 stops, then plus 3 stops. Here's my final tone-mapped image, where I've brought out the green and red tones. The extra precision of the HDR merged image means you can push and pull tonal ranges much more aggressively without artifacting. Let's explore how filter values affect the infrared image. My converted camera has a 590 nanometer filter, which lets through false color, characterized as red light. Putting a 720 nanometer filter on reduces the amount of false color, and we're now starting to filter through just infrared wavelengths. Notice this image is much more monochrome. Next, we've got an 850 nanometer filter, and by now we've lost any kind of false color, so we're in pure infrared territory. We would only use this filter strength and above for monochrome or black and white imagery. Finally, there's the 950 nanometer filter. This is very similar to the 850 nanometer filter, but with a reduced exposure time. I've gone from a 1/80 shutter speed with the 850 to a 1/25 shutter speed with the 950. So this filter strength could be useful for long exposure photography, especially if combined with a neutral density filter. Let's take a quick look at some edited images. Here's the 590 nanometer filter, where I've swapped the red and blue channels. The false color allows us to achieve a distinct colorful result. Then we've got the 720 nanometer filter, which has again had the red and blue channels swapped. We've got less false color this time, which results in a more muted image. Then we've got the 950 nanometer filter, which I've applied a black and white conversion to, as we have no false color information to work with here. Finally, here is a little tip if you didn't white balance your camera when shooting with an infrared filter. For this image, I left the white balance on auto, which has resulted in a heavy red color cast. You can use Affinity Photo's white balance picker. In this case, I've chosen some foliage to balance off, and it will neutralize the image's white balance. I would always recommend white balancing in camera though, because with this image the camera has exposed for the red channel at the expense of precision in the green and blue channels. You can see this by the very fast shutter speed used up here. It means this image will likely be noisier and won't handle further tonal adjustments, as well as an image that was balanced in camera with a lower shutter speed. And that wraps up this episode on infrared shooting. I hope it's given you some ideas and inspired you to try infrared photography. You can dabble in using screw-on filters, but just be aware that you'll need to bring a tripod for the long exposures. It may be worth investing in a cheap converted body simply for the convenience of throwing a lens on and being able to walk around freely taking infrared photographs. I've mainly shot landscapes and architecture, but you can also try infrared for other genres like portraiture. It lends skin a soft, glowing look, although you would have to take extra care to light the eyes, otherwise the subject will look a bit creepy. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to check out the other shooting series videos and accompanying articles.